I'm going to do something a little bit different. Well, not so much different, but a little bit different today. There is a new book out. It's called The Final Witness, and it is written by a guy named Paul Landis. Landis is 88 years old. At the time, he was 28 years old, and he was one of the Secret Service agents whose job on November 22nd, 1963, was to protect the president and first lady. Actually, the first lady. He was part of her detail, and she asked for him to accompany the group to Dallas once it was decided that she, Jackie Kennedy, was going to go. And after 60 years, Mr. Landis has decided to write about what happened, what he witnessed on that last day. And I don't know if you call it the controversial part of the book, where there were a number of Parkland Hospital doctors, which is where Kennedy was pronounced dead in Dallas, who agreed when they examined his body as it was brought in that one of the wounds that killed him was an entry wound in his neck, in the front of his neck. After his body was shipped to Washington, D.C. for the official autopsy, that was eliminated. Now, I'm not one who's big for conspiracy theories, but until my dying day, I will never, ever, ever, I cannot believe that Lee Harvey Oswald singly was responsible for the assassination of John Kennedy. I cannot do it. So when this book came out, and I think it was published just last month, and I haven't read it yet, The Final Witness, but I have paid attention to some of the excerpts that have been talked about on television, and it just rekindles whatever doubt I had that might have been lessening over the decades. It rekindles that doubt and makes me believe, yes, I and millions of us Americans were right from the beginning. This was not Lee Harvey Oswald assassinating the president by himself. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to quote directly. James Robinall wrote a piece for the Washington Post, and it is mostly the recollections of Agent Paul Landis. That's what I'm going to share with you. Paul Landis stood guard outside Parkland Memorial Hospital's trauma room number 1 as Father Oscar Huber rushed past, dressed in his Roman collar. It was just before 1 p.m. on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. Less than half an hour earlier, Landis had been riding on the running board of a Secret Service car when he witnessed President John F. Kennedy's murder up close as the motorcade drove through Dallas's Dealey Plaza. Now, as the 28-year-old agent kept an eye on his official protectee, the stunned First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, he watched Father Huber enter the trauma room to deliver Kennedy's last rites. Huber, speaking in Latin, whispered into the president's ear. Translated, the prayer went, "If it is possible, I absolve you from your sins in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen." For Agent Landis, who was raised Presbyterian in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, Catholic rituals were a mystery. But he knew this final blessing was of critical importance to the First Lady. He waited outside the room for Jackie and Father Huber to emerge. Landis is now 88. He's one of the few survivors who had a first-hand view of the tragedy. He is only now telling his whole story in a book published last month entitled The Final Witness. 60 years after the assassination, the events of November 22nd, 1963 have come to seem like a chapter firmly rooted in history, the subject of debate and conspiracy theories among many people born multiple generations later. But to Landis, his memories from Dealey Plaza and Parkland remain immediate, and the revelations those memories bring are helping reshape our understanding of that fateful day. President Kennedy's casket was transferred from Air Force One to a waiting ambulance following arrival at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland from Dallas. I have worked with Agent Landis over the past 6 months, helping him prepare for the media attention that we knew would follow his book's publication. Much of that attention focused on his assertion that he found an intact bullet on top of the rear car seat behind where Kennedy was shot, a claim that has cast fresh doubt on official narratives of the assassination. But we've also had many conversations about his experience on November 22nd and the complicated nature of memory in the aftermath of a trauma. Landis was only there in Dallas because Jackie Kennedy, in whose security detail he served, had decided to accompany her husband on his campaign trip. It was his first trip in a motorcade. In the moments before the president was shot, Landis was scanning the relatively thin crowd as the presidential limousine and his follow-up car, codenamed Halfback, drove along Elm Street below the Texas School Book Depository. The crowds were enthusiastic and non-threatening. Landis recalled, quote, "I just remember as we moved closer to the business district, there was a lady among a group of children holding up a sign that read, 'Please stop, Mr. President.' We started to pass by, but the president stopped the limo and started to shake hands with the children and adults, who immediately converged on the car. All the agents jumped off the follow-up car and took up protective positions around the limo until we started moving again. I heard the lady with the sign yell in excitement, 'It worked! Our sign worked!' As the cavalcade reached Dealey Plaza and the cars drove toward the Stemmons Freeway, a shot rang out." Landis said, quote, "When we reached Dealey Plaza and the cars straightened, the first thing I heard was a sharp report that I immediately recognized as the sound of a high-powered rifle. I had been around guns all my life as a sportsman and Secret Service agent, so I knew the sound of rifles. It wasn't a firecracker." He looked around and saw the president leaning forward. Then he shifted toward the First Lady, but Landis didn't know whether he had been hit. Then 2 more shots followed. I saw a flash of white as the right side of President Kennedy's head exploded in a pink spray of blood, flesh, and brain matter. I automatically ducked, not wanting to be splattered as we drove through it." End quote. Once at Parkland, Agent Landis witnessed a scene of pure horror. The inside of the limo looked as if a bomb had gone off. Blood, human tissue, and bullet fragments were scattered everywhere. Jackie Kennedy was bent over her husband's head, which she cradled in her lap. She wanted no one to see his condition. She wouldn't let go. Landis and Agent Clint Hill, also on the First Lady's detail, climbed into the back seat. I said, "Let me help you, Mrs. Kennedy." And she kept repeating, "No, no, no, I want to stay with him," Agent Landis remembered. And she would not release the president. Finally, he said, Agent Hill figured out that he needed to remove his coat and cover the president's head so no one would see the devastating head wound. With this, Jackie finally surrendered her husband's body. Landis noticed 2 bullet fragments in a pool of blood next to where Jackie sat. Then he saw a fully intact bullet on top of the rear seat, he said, behind where the president had been sitting when the final shot or shots knocked him violently back and to the left. He said, "I scanned the area, noticing that all the agents were rushing into the emergency room, and there was no one left to secure the limo." Worried that the intact bullet might be lost or stolen by a souvenir seeker, Landis picked up the bullet and took it into the hospital. He would leave it on the president's stretcher in trauma room number 1, expecting it to be found by the doctors during an autopsy. Landis knew the president was dead the moment he saw the final hit to his head. The clock on top of the Texas School Book Depository read 12:30 p.m. It quickly became clear that there was no chance of saving Kennedy, yet doctors still made an effort to resuscitate him. Landis says, quote, "After all, this was the President of the United States." Landis was in complete shock. He said, "My greatest fear was that I was going to pass out." The image in his mind of the president's exploding head would not stop playing as if on a loop. As he stood outside the trauma room, he focused on the First Lady, who entered the trauma room several times. He said, "I was only a few feet from her when she stood up and walked into an area of the emergency room with curtained booths. She stood there for some time staring at the wall. I walked over and asked her if there was anything I could do. She just shook her head no." From the middle of that day, one memory stands out for Landis, when a committee had to decide the time of death. White House Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff huddled with Landis and others present. Landis said, Kilduff said, "We need to have everything in proper sequence. What we will say to the public and the press when the last rites were given. Everything in proper sequence." End quote. Landis would have placed the time of death at 12:30 p.m. Central Time when the sniper's bullet or bullets hit the president's head. But because Father Huber hadn't arrived at Parkland until nearly 1 p.m., the group agreed to set the time of death at 1 p.m. to comfort the family and the nation with the fiction that the president had survived long enough to receive the last rites of the Catholic Church. And so it would be. As Press Secretary Kilduff famously made the death announcement to the press in a room at Parkland Hospital, normally used as a nurse's classroom. With high emotion and a breaking voice, Kilduff said, "President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president." That time, 1 p.m., was picked up by Walter Cronkite on CBS News, who interrupted the soap opera, As the World Turns, to tell the nation of the president's death. He said, "From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago." He took off his glasses and choked up. Meanwhile, Landis was on his way to Love Field with the president's casket. He would fly back to D.C. on Air Force One. He said, "I broke down on the plane. I probably cried the entire way to Washington." His thoughts were with the Kennedy children he knew so well and the First Lady in the back of the plane, sitting next to the casket containing the remains of her husband. History changed that day, and so did Landis's life. He toughed it out for another 6 months on protective duty for Jackie Kennedy and her children. But when his nightmare wouldn't dissipate, he knew it was time to leave. 60 years later, he finally has unburdened himself of his memories. Well, the name of the book, written by Agent Paul Landis, the title of the book is The Final Witness. You may be old enough to have memories of that day. I certainly am. I was in the living room of a house in Adrian, Michigan. The reason I was in that living room was I was there to finalize an order for magazine subscriptions. It was an order placed by a company that I was doing some part-time work for. Eventually, I went to work in circulation for Look magazine, but at that time, I worked in what they euphemistically called the fulfillment department of Look magazine, which meant making sure the subscriptions were sold properly. But I was standing in the living room of this couple, and it was a middle-aged couple, probably in their 50s, maybe their early 60s, and the television was on. And I was giving my little spiel to these people about the benefits of the magazines they were about to purchase. And all of a sudden, the wife called our attention to the television screen. And yes, there was Walter Cronkite. And when he said what he said, Cronkite, about Kennedy being assassinated, the man to whom I was talking, I'll remember this as clearly as if it happened yesterday. He had a sharp intake of breath, just like, and the woman clutched her hands together at her breast, and they looked at each other and back at the TV screen, and at that point I said, I had better go. Nobody said a word after that, and I walked out. I got in the car, and I drove to downtown to Adrian, and I noticed that, and this was on a Friday, there were not that many people on the street. And I went to the nearest cafe, nearest little diner that I could find, because I knew there would be a telephone in there. And I went in and I asked, and there was a television over the bar, and there were 2 or 3 people in there and the counterman, and they were all staring at the television. And when I walked in, I said, "Is there a phone here I can use?" And I remember he gave me a phone that wasn't a pay phone, which I thought was, very decent of him. I said, "I've got to call my family." And he put a phone on the countertop. And I called my mother. And I called the girl I was dating at the time, who was very much a Catholic. And she was just sobbing. I couldn't talk to her. She said, "I'll see you when you come home." And she hung up. And that weekend was just an astonishing weekend. And again, I remember every single frame as if I'm watching a slideshow. The solemnity that just saturated this country. There was just nothing. The entire country was just dead silent. Now, I know there were millions of people, especially in the South, who were celebrating this assassination, but I wasn't in the South. I was in Ohio. And, of course, everybody seemed to be glued to their television sets. And then the funeral procession through D.C. with the riderless horse, and the Kennedy family walking behind the caisson that was carrying the casket. All of that is just what I will remember until I suck in my last breath. And I'm glad that Agent Landis has now written about what he witnessed. And I'm sure there's more detail that I'll have to discover when I read that book. But again, even then, and then it was, just 3 days later when Jack Ruby assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald in the police station in Dallas as they were trying to move him, Lee Harvey Oswald, to a different facility. And then, of course, Jack Ruby dying. It just goes on and on and on and on. One of the best movies about this is the movie JFK. If you haven't seen that, it might be worth renting over the weekend. But from that moment, it was difficult, if not impossible, for me to accept what eventually became the official story. And especially when the Warren Commission, several years later, put together what they said was the sine qua non or whatever of the investigations where it concerned the assassination of Kennedy, and they came to the single bullet conclusion, a single bullet that hit Kennedy and Governor John Connally and so on and so forth. And I don't believe a word of it. The only part of what happened on November 22nd, 1963, that I believe is that Kennedy was assassinated. That's it. That I know happened. But what do I believe about the Kennedy assassination? You might be asking yourself. Well, to put it in as few words as possible, that it was in fact a conspiracy put together by the CIA, by certain capitalist interests in this country, and that people used to carry out the assassination included members of a mafia family. I can even tell you the family's name, Santo Trafficante. That is my belief. And unless and until a different, more believable version is available to me, that's what I will continue to believe. This was not the act by one crazy lefty named Lee Harvey Oswald. It was not. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.